David, are you
Yes,
there?
yes, finally.
Welcome. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened there, but glad that you're able to join us just in the nick of time.
Absolutely, yes, I'm glad that I made it. Yes, and thanks for responding so quickly to my message.
No problem at all. No, thanks for sending. So glad you could make it. I see people are starting to join now, and it is 2 o'clock. So maybe give it 1 more minute to let a few more people. It's always a few drips and drabs, and then we can get started, because I know we don't have a lot of time, and I have quite a few questions I'd like to ask our panel. So let's give it another minute, and then I will kick things off.
Hi, David. Good to see you.
Yes, indeed, Trudy, as always. Good to see you too. And great to meet the other colleagues on the panel. Helmut, certainly I don't think we've met before, as well as, of course, Ivano. Great to meet you both.
Hi, David.
David, we met virtually, but a year ago with Trudy as well on this conference of my German colleagues here, where we should have made at the shores of a lake here next to Berlin, but things didn't allow, and I think we even met physically before.
Okay, thanks for reminding me. Well, all the better. Yes.
Great. I think then we can get started. We have quite a few people in, and I'm sure there'll be some more. But since time is pressing, let's get going. So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this second webinar in ECDPM's series of webinars that we're organizing with the support of BMZ, the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, on connecting Africa's markets and people. Before we begin, can I just please ask all of you joining to keep your mics muted so we can minimize disruptions? Thank you very much for that. So in today's webinar, we want to explore the link between the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA, this very important, high-profile, prominent process that is currently underway across the African continent, and the long-term vision of a continent-to-continent trade agreement between Africa and the EU, an objective that has been expressed in a number of communications by the European Commission, and which was also addressed earlier this week by the Deputy Chair of the African Union Commission in her opening address at the AU-EU Joint Ministerial, where she noted that collaboration towards such a vision would be fully aligned with the implementation of the AfCFTA and efforts to deepen African economic integration. So at ECDPM, we've produced a short briefing note on this topic, which you can find on our homepage. And in it, we investigate if and how the implementation of the AfCFTA actually paves the way for a continent-to-continent trade agreement, whether working towards such an agreement is the most appropriate approach to strengthen trade ties between the two continents, and what practically policymakers on both sides can and should do to strengthen these trade ties, whether or not towards a continent-to-continent free trade agreement. But the point of today's session is not to present our findings, but rather to hear different expert perspectives on this link between the AfCFTA and the vision of a continent-to-continent trade agreement. And in that regard, we're very, very privileged to be joined this afternoon by a panel of experts who I believe are particularly well placed to speak on this theme, and who I will now introduce. So we have joining us David Luke, who is a professor in practice and strategic director at the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa at the London School of Economics and Political Science, but whom many of us will know from his time heading the African Trade Policy Center at UNECA, where he and his team were instrumental in the preparation of the AfCFTA agreement protocols, amongst many other things. We're also joined by Trudy Hartzenberg, who is the Executive Director at TRALAC and a renowned expert on all things related to African trade policy, African regional integration, African investment policy, and industrial and competition policy, and a committed advocate of capacity building in these areas. We're also joined by Ivano Casella, who has spent more than 2 decades at the European Commission's Directorate General for Trade, DG Trade, where he is currently the Trade Policy Officer in charge of the implementation of the EU-Africa trade strategy, and EU-Africa trade relations at the continent level. So very relevant for today's discussion. And finally, we're joined by Helmut Asch, who is an honorary professor at the Department of Anthropology and African Studies at the University of Mainz, and who's also the author of a recently published volume on regional integration, trade and industry in Africa, a very interesting book, which also deals with EU-Africa trade relations as well. So to the panelists, I just want to say again, thank you so much for making the time to join us today. And we're very excited to have you and to have a discussion with you. Those of you joining us, before we start the panel session, can I please invite you to pose your own questions to the panelists, where relevant, indicating if there's a specific panelist you would like to address a question to, by using the chat function. My colleague Philomena will monitor the chat box, and we'll try to reserve some time towards the end of our session to have a Q&A. So please feel free to pop your questions in the chat box, and we'll keep track of that. So thank you for that. Okay, then without further ado, I'll turn to our panel. And the first question I have, I'd like to actually address to you, Ivano. And I would like to ask, the first time I read or heard about this idea of a continent-to-continent trade agreement, I think it was in the European Commission communication. I think it was the Juncker plan, I think it was, where this is the first time I noticed this. So I'd be interested to know a bit, where does this idea of a continent-to-continent trade agreement, where does it come from, and why has it emerged in the last sort of 2 or 3 years as a very explicit, albeit long-term, ambition of the European Commission and the European Union?
Thank you, Sean. So very pleased to be in this panel and to speak to all of you about this subject and to interact with the other panelists on this interesting topic. I think the idea was first, as you said, mentioned in the State of the Union at the time where the Commission President was Juncker. And it was a kind of natural reflection with regard to our trade relationship with Africa that has been going through different phases, a very long phase of preparatory talks, and to which I participated when I was younger, much younger than now, and a very long negotiating period which lasted 15 years or so, and then the achievement of these trade agreements that we have had with several countries in Africa. And the basic philosophy of the EU was, of course, to support regional integration processes in the continent and not having to impose any model in that regard. And I think that, and with North Africa, and I shouldn't forget North African countries, we have had similar paths, or albeit a little bit different, in negotiating individual association agreements. So we had these patchworks of trade agreements, and then of course came this project that we were very keen to support since the outset from the Africans themselves of creating the African Continental Free Trade Area. So it was very natural in that sense to make the synthesis of both, that the fact that we have had trade relations supporting integration initiatives in the continent, and at the same time having an integration process taking shape on the continents, and therefore envisaging something that could relate to a continent-to-continent initiative. But I would be very straightforward to say that this continent-to-continent initiative is not something that the EU wants to work on for the time being. I mean, Africa is already taking the initiative to build its own continental free trade area, which, as I said, we fully support. We are stepping up our partnership with the African Union and have provided quite substantial amount of support, financial support, to support the African Continental Free Trade Area. And more important than establishing a date or a timeline to continue to support to do a continent-to-continent initiative is to continue to work together on the existing trade arrangement and supporting the clear determination from our African partners to make their continental free trade area a reality. As a first, for us, this is a first necessary step towards any wider trade arrangements. So, in other words, what we considered, what we have achieved over the past years and decades, these economic partnership agreements, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the association agreement in North Africa are in reality a building blocks to the benefits of the continental free trade area. And of course, building on that, on this continental free trade area implementation, the long-term vision is at some point, whenever our African partners will have progressed in their implementation and reached the level of customs union, to work towards a comprehensive continent-to-continent free trade agreement between the EU and Africa. But as I said, this for the EU is not for the EU to decide that, and it's not something that sort of organize our work for the moment. We are working on what exists on the ground to make it effective, to make it beneficial, and to work towards the implementation of the continental free trade area. This is for us the essential priority at the moment.
Great, thank you. Yes, I mean, I think you've touched on some things that I do want to come back to in our discussion, particularly on the sort of emerging roadmap to a long-term vision and what's realistic in the short term and what to focus on. Certainly, I will come back to you on that. But maybe before I get there, a question to you, David, as someone who has really had a lot of interaction with African policymakers, in the context of the AfCFTA in particular, but elsewhere, and also as someone who has engaged, I think, with this idea of African countries negotiating as a bloc, working as a united bloc. What is your perspective in terms of the appetite on the African side for this long-term vision, for the idea of one day, if not necessarily tomorrow or the next year or in the immediate or short-term future, but one day having a continent-to-continent type arrangement? Do you see an appetite from here across Africa? And I include North African states in that as well, because sometimes we tend to talk about Sub-Saharan Africa, EU relations, but as Ivano mentioned, there's also the relations with North African states. So I'd like to hear a bit what your sort of sense is of the appetite on the African side for such a long-term vision.
Thanks, Sean, and firstly, thanks for inviting me, and also thanks to ECDPM for setting up this discussion. And just allow me to recognize my fellow panelists, Trudy Atzenberg, whom I've known for many years, Helmut Asche, and Ivano Casella, whom I'm delighted to share this panel with. Before I turn to your question, let me just add a few words to what Ivano just said. I think the idea also comes from Pan-Africanism. That is the shared historical experience that Africans have of colonial rule, the sense of loss of the interruption of the pre-colonial evolution of African economies and societies, inevitably the struggles of the African people everywhere for racial equality. So whatever differences between Africans and African countries, Pan-Africanism as a guiding and binding ideology remains also a driving force for a continental approach. Unlike any other ideology, it of course has its internal tensions. So let me turn to your question. I would say yes, there is an appetite for this. The AfCFTA agreement itself states very clearly that a continental customs union is envisaged, so in effect to consolidate the African market as a bloc. And as we all know, there are several official articulations of an ambition to negotiate as one. And as you said at the beginning, Sean, the deputy chairperson of the African Union reiterated this at the EU-Africa meeting this week in Rwanda. But most importantly, I think the seeds for effective coordination have already been sown, as we see in the intergovernmental process for coordination, whether multilaterally at the WTO with bilateral partners and within the African RECs and the continent as a whole. Now, if there appears to be contradictions in the way this appetite is being manifested, it is because of a very powerful force, which I'll describe as misaligned incentives. And in my view, the only way you can overcome this powerful force of misaligned incentives is to get the sequencing of the African integration project right, vis-a-vis the trade commitments with Europe, Africa's biggest trading partner, as well as other third parties. Let me take this issue of misaligned incentives first. And on this matter, I have to say that the EU is not an innocent bystander. The fragmentation of EU trade policy towards Africa, in effect, constitutes a negative incentive for achieving trade policy coherence on the African side. Integral to the EU's patchwork of agreements and instruments, north and south of the Sahara, is a conditionality for market access security, particularly on non-LDCs, to accept and adhere to the trade regime devised by the EU for its own purposes. African countries were not the demanders of this regime. Faced with a colonial legacy of little intra-African trade and the reality of Europe as a dominant, stable, and mature market with a long history of preferential market access, African countries have little choice than to accept the overwhelming incentive of adherence to this regime. So trapped in this trade regime as it has evolved with Europe, interests within African countries, their trade structures, and investment patterns are aligned with the status quo. Only a country like Nigeria, with a large internal market, a hegemon in its region, and a fuel-dominated export sector that hardly attracts duties or quotas, can afford to be a refusenik. The reality on the ground in Africa is that the stronger incentive and business case is to prioritize trade with Europe over intra-African trade. And we see that the EU has begun to move forward into deepening its existing EPAs and arrangements in North Africa. Negotiations have commenced to add chapters on investment, services, intellectual property rights, and so on. And in North Africa, the EU is deepening deep and comprehensive free trade area agreements with a number of these countries. The risk with all of this is that if care is not taken, this will further deepen divisions between the African countries, making African trade policy consolidation even more difficult. Now, let me quickly say a few words on sequencing. If trade policy is ever to be achieved, if trade policy coherence is ever to be achieved on the African side, there is need for proper sequencing of trade liberalization with the EU and other advanced industrial countries, which should only come after the AfCFTA is fully in place. This will ensure that the gains from the EPAs or the association agreements for both Africa and the EU will still materialize later. The negative effects of displacing intra-African trade and its industrialization potential will be mitigated. So let me just end with this. So the sequencing of trade agreements, of trade reforms and negotiations of new trade deals do matter for Africa. This suggests that AfCFTA implementation should be prioritized over reciprocal trade deals with third parties. In time, this approach will ensure substantial benefits for all. It is by allowing such a sequence that the required incentives can emerge for the AfCFTA to become an instrument for deeper integration within the continent and its further evolution into a customs union and continental platform for engaging with third parties. And let me just, in concluding these remarks on this question, just add that this sequencing argument also has a practical expediency. A significant risk here is of policy distraction or attention diversion. As currently Africa's most significant trading partner, the EU will continue to absorb considerable African trade policy making attention. But further deepening EPAs and parallel arrangements in North Africa risk stretching already constrained African negotiating capacities. That the EPA negotiations took so long to conclude and that the remaining technical aspects of the AfCFTA negotiations remain elusive stem not from disinterest, but negotiating capacity constraints, particularly in Africa's least developed countries. Most African countries, even the middle-income ones, have few trade negotiators and limited budgets. This can lead them to react on the back foot to negotiations pushed and structured by more sophisticated partners rather than focusing on their predetermined priorities. So how do we get sequencing right? I do have an answer to this question as to what the alternative policy approach would look like. And I hope to be able to come back to that. But let me stop here and over to you, Sean.
Yeah, thank you. No, I do want to follow up with you on that. But before I come back to you on that, maybe Trudy, if I can turn to you. I mean, I think David has hinted at some hurdles, let's say, in terms of trying to, in an ideal world, get towards a continent-to-continent arrangement that works for both sides. The reality is we're not starting from a blank slate. We have a set of existing arrangements. From your perspective, what are the key hurdles? What are the key challenges? How far away are we talking about? I mean, in terms of being able to, we heard Ivano say this is like a long-term vision. We're not talking about something we're negotiating or talking about now. David has talked about the need to get the sequencing right. How far away are we from discussing a continent-to-continent negotiation process? And what are the key challenges that we need to get right on sequencing or other things to be able to get there?
Thanks so much, Sean, and thank you so much to David and Ivano for those contributions. I think just listening to the two perspectives from the two continents, so to speak, it's apparent how complex this discussion actually is, and the enormous asymmetry and challenges that exist within the context of each bloc, if you want to call it that. If we take a look at our own African integration project, and let's call it that for the time being, we are moving along at different speeds, different trajectories to consolidate this continental integration agenda. And I think when one takes a look at where we stand in the AfCFTA negotiations, now we understand that the enormous asymmetry within this collection of African Union member states, or the state parties, if you will, of the African Continental Free Trade Area, points to the difficulties of integrating unequal partners just on our side. If we take a look at the relationship with the European Union, as David indicates, this is an extremely important trade, development, investment partnership, and it will continue to be that for quite some time to come. And that, I think, we need to keep in mind. Our discussion about a continent-to-continent free trade agreement and focusing on an FDA a la GATT Article 24 can be deceptively seductive. And I think we've got to be extremely careful to ask a number of prior questions. What kind of mutually beneficial, constructive, respectful, trustful trade governance partnership between Africa on the one hand and the European Union on the other is actually the focus going forward? And I'm saying that because if we think about a free trade area, and let's focus on trade in goods here, where the two minimum requirements are tariff concessions and rules of origin, we can see how difficult that is. And it's not only difficult in terms of the AfCFTA negotiations, but both David and Ivano have reminded us about the EPA negotiations. And so an interesting question really is, what should be the agenda, the scope, the architecture of a trade governance regime, continent to continent going forward? And my sense is that, to be honest, it needs to focus far more on a non-traditional agenda. And I think one needs to think creatively about how we shape that mutually beneficial trade governance and trade supporting governance regime. If we just think about the future of tariffs in the bigger context, the European Union is introducing step by step a myriad of initiatives, policies, regulations, and a raft of legislation under the Green Deal, where border adjustment measures are going to become increasingly important. They may, in the not too distant future, completely dwarf the import tariff. So one starts seeing there's an emergence of a new agenda, which is particularly important in terms of managing market access. So that's one example. And then there's, of course, the agenda around digital trade, and that's regulatory intensive. It requires capacity, and David's reminded us that we have a long way to go in so many areas on our side as African member states of the African Union, but also within our regional economic communities and in the context of the AfCFTA. So these are two areas where I see enormous potential for a mutually beneficial trade governance relationship emerging, but it's not cast as a traditional WTO compatible, the usual formula. Let's put tariffs, rules of origin, and the other issues on that agenda, because we may well paint ourselves into a very, very difficult corner there. And we're missing the opportunities, and we're addressing issues which are yesterday's agenda rather than the agenda which is emerging as an important a new trade governance paradigm. So I think we've got to be particularly careful. A question I would like to ask of the European Union, for example, is at what point would the European Union be comfortable with an offer to all African Union member states of duty-free, quota-free market access? And if we are going to focus on tariffs, an asymmetric arrangement, which may look at differential tariff offers from the African partners, the customs unions that exist, and the individual member states that don't belong to customs unions, because then we're talking, then we really are starting to change the agenda and start looking at a constructive engagement which offers meaningful market access, but also brings forward an agenda which really strengthens our productive capacity, our capacity to comply with a new and an emerging governance agenda, climate-related issues, and the important governance issues around trade and services, digital trade, e-commerce, and so on. Because these are areas I would like to suggest where the European Union has a huge amount to offer. Sometimes, let it be said, of what not to do, equally as to what actually has worked, because the EU formula we know can simply not be transplanted to Africa. But there are lessons and some engagement supported by, I would say, capacity building may well, depending on what we as an African continent deem to be appropriate and important, what we want. So it can't be the EU coming to us with a platter and saying, you know what, this is the menu, take it or leave it. Those days are over. It has to be a respectful, very important, constructive engagement of agenda setting, determining mutual benefits, opportunities, but also challenges that have to be negotiated very carefully. So I would argue very much, if we think traditionally in terms of a customs union to customs union negotiation, it's a long, long way off. But there's no reason for us to follow that pathway. We can do things differently. And I would hate to think that we'd miss the opportunity of being innovative in terms of discussing what future trade governance relationships between this very important partnership could look like. Thanks, Sean.
Great. Thanks, Trudy. And Ivana, I'm going to come back to you in a bit. Trudy had a very good question and don't want to put you on the spot immediately. So I'll give you a few minutes to think about the question about the duty-free, quota-free access for all of Africa and this sort of asymmetric approach. But before I do that, I wanted to come to you, Helmut, and ask, I mean, you're someone who's looked at the EPA process and arrangements. Your new book goes into quite detail on sort of the current state of play in terms of Europe-Africa trade arrangements and also intra-African trade arrangements. Heeding Trudy's call for a more innovative approach and to kind of be wary of the risks of a path-dependent approach, do you see the current set of arrangements as conducive to a sort of more innovative approach to exploring opportunities in terms of the relationship between the two continents? Do you see these risks of path dependency, and how do you have some thoughts on how to kind of go from where we are with the arrangements to a more innovative approach and to strengthening Europe-Africa trade ties?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I mean, this is a tricky question. With what I'm going to say, I'm essentially talk again truly won't like it, about how negotiations on trade in goods and mainly on tariffs and rules of origin currently stand. And the state of affairs is obviously not very good. I would love to talk about something else and innovative myself as well, but probably the political economy thing is, if we do not repair the damage that is currently done in EU-Africa relations in terms of trade in goods, the very traditional things, then there is no logic, and that is perhaps a complication to which we should probably return at the end. There is no guarantee in political economy that dealing with other things, services, in particular e-commerce and what else is fashionable currently, will evolve differently than what we have started between EU and Africa in terms of trade and goods. That is the classical stuff. That is perhaps the tricky question. I didn't want to start with that, but I advanced this question to make myself a bit relevant to Trudy, and instead of saying irrelevant things. So, but now I duly come back to what you asked me precisely. The current state of EU-African trade relations as measured by the EPAs, could also be the Northern African trade agreements, but let's stick to the EPAs for a second, is not good. I would love to dismantle for good the famous building block argument, not that African regs should be building blocks for the CFTA, as in the CFTA agreement contained, that is good. But the agreements between the EU, the current agreements between the EU as exemplified by the EPAs, are no proper building blocks for a continent-to-continent agreement of whatever sort. It is simply not acceptable that way. I mean, it is a bit tedious and boring as a task. Everybody who is in the details knows that not a single of the current EPAs on the African side is concluded with an existing regional economic community. Instead of doing it, single countries are taken out of existing or emerging customs unions and have or had to sign separate agreements. Then you have a group like the EPA group, which is a completely strange group of 5 countries which do not share anything else than a maritime border and so on. So we have, in terms of coverage, a completely disparate picture. We have also, in terms of content, a completely unacceptable agenda in the current EPAs and their implementation that is severely restricting the policy space, especially when countries or regions venture into creating deliberately more protective capacity, the issue to which both my previous speakers alluded. So the optic of, as the EU saying goes, if Ivano has not put it in these words already, of confidently continuing with implementation of the EPAs and then moving on to a higher scale, or extracting from the confident implementation of the EPAs, they're deepening and widening some issues to be treated right away at a higher scale, is simply not the sequencing that can be accepted. There is to be repair work. There is to be repair work and revision in and with the EPAs, and European governments have to accept this, and the Commission as well, unless you consider the case so desperate, and that is a bit behind the suggestion of Trudy, I think, and perhaps not David, but behind Trudy's suggestion, I suppose, unless you consider the current EPA landscape so desperate that you say, okay, let's try to move right away to a duty-free, quota-free option and offer at a continental scale in less instead of spending more time on these one by one or small group by small group EPAs as we currently do. It is not confident implementation and then moving on. The EPAs are no building blocks, they are impediments to everything at a higher level, and that has to be accepted.
Thanks, Helmut. So Ivano, putting you on the spot a bit here. You mentioned this idea of EPAs as building blocks for the AfCFTA, to which we can see that there are some doubts about the effectiveness of this. Helmut calls for repair work. Trudy talks about building sorry, Trudy, I forgot the exact term used, but it's sort of a trust-based relationship, if I paraphrase you correctly, and also ask this question of, could we be more innovative? Could there be scope for a duty-free, quota-free offer to all of Africa, regardless of status of middle income or what? What is the European Commission's thinking on these issues at the moment? What are the steps? What is on the table in terms of discussion to go from where we are now, where there are some doubts, there is some dissatisfaction perhaps on both sides with the current state of the relationship, but a desire to move towards a more constructive, potentially continent to continent in the long-term arrangement in the future? What is really on the table in the short to medium term to get there?
Look, Sean, I mean, I hear all the criticism, and actually these are not new. I mean, I've been around enough, and I've heard these criticisms since the very beginning of the EPA process. So I've been through that, and we have measured and assessed and reflected deeply on all these aspects. Now, first of all, before responding to the question, I would like to respond to Trudy and what she has said, which is particularly interesting, and I think that the new challenges ahead of us justifies and imposes on us a reflection, a strategic reflections, and on what we could jointly agree together. There are new areas of discussions out there that are extremely important, related to the Green Deal, related to cyber trade, that Trudy has very well outlined, that in my view are of extremely importance and should also occupy ourselves and occupy our future trade agenda. Now, this being said, look, with the EPA, our approach has been always the same since the beginning: not to leave any country on the side of the street, of the trade street or the trade road, not to leave any. So, and I remember passing this message already 15 years ago, but okay, I mean, it's part of my job and I'm paid for this and I'm happy to do it. So I will have to redo it again. What we have done throughout this very long EPA and tumultuous road was precisely to ask our partners in Africa to come to us and tell us what is their preference and how would they like to be their trade relationship with the EU profitable for their own development. We have never imposed any model to our partners in Africa. The distinction was between LDCs and non-LDCs. The trade with the EU for the LDCs was covered by other regimes. So these were out of the pictures. And of course, the only exception is with regard to North Africa, which we might have a different webinar for that, because it's a completely different matters. And of course, there we have real difficulties that we have to deal with. When we focus on Sub-Saharan Africa, our discussion has been very genuine, and was to say to the non-LDCs, would you like to enter into a negotiation with us for these economic partnership agreements? You choose whether it is something that you would like to do with us, if it's a product that satisfies your needs. And we have always been receptive to the request of the member states, of the African Union member states, that were willing to negotiate with us, never imposing any model. So I think this is extremely important to say. And what we have seen is that not all the countries have responded positively, and we have never blamed anybody for that. We have always accepted the situation. The situation was indeed a very peculiar architecture. I agree, that does not fit with the regional economic communities in Africa. We might see, by the way, something different emerging in the coming months and years with EAC, but let's see what happens. But of course, that doesn't take out the intention, the willingness, and the interest from the African countries to come to us, to be demandeur for having their trade relations to be handled and to be formatized into something that provides security and that provides stability and development. This is what we have tried to achieve with EPA. Is it the outcome perfect? Far from perfect. I take the criticism, but let's adjust it. And how do we adjust it? We adjust it by seeing that in some cases, LDC countries that will see their status of LDCs in the UN being phased out are coming to us, asking us to be part of the EPA. Okay, so I mean, we cannot be sort of more receptive to the African partners than what we have been doing. And we take the criticism, we take the fact that we need to reflect on how to address these difficulties and these differences of trade trade treatment through different trade agreements. But the objective has been that one, first point. The second point is regard to duty-free, quota-free. This is the reality of what we have done since the beginning. We have done, when we have offered through the EPAs, duty-free, quota-free. I say, except North Africa, please. This is the only exception. But when it comes to Sub-Saharan Africa, that's what we have done to those countries who wanted to negotiate with us. So de facto, we have put on the table duty-free, quota-free. It's difficult to be more comprehensive than that. The key thing, and Trudy was absolutely right, the key thing is now the differences that we have on rules of origin. And it's the new challenges that Trudy outlined. On rules of origin, in our trade policy communication that we have adopted in February early this year, we have acknowledged that we have an issue that we have to deal with, that we have different types of rules of origin between our agreement that are not conducive to uniformity and to trade among African countries themselves. And this we would like to talk about this with our partners in Africa, and maybe we will have a chance to do so in the forthcoming summit that we will have with the African Union. So we fully acknowledge the fact that issues that we have to deal with. But of course, at the same time, and I would like other panelists also to acknowledge that our interlocutors are the African member states, okay? And we are not, as the European Union, imposing any model on them. Actually, they are coming to us, asking us to do and to negotiate, to be part of existing trade agreements or to negotiate new types of agreements. We have to be receptive. At the same time, we have to be innovative, tackling the deficiencies, the problems that have emerged. At the same time, the only thing that we care for the moment as the EU is, of course, keeping these agreements alive, because we think that EPAs, unlike the criticism, we think that EPAs have helped to provide expertise, have helped to get these countries used to trade liberalization, have created a legal framework that has helped to attract foreign direct investment, and so on and so forth. There are numerous studies that prove what I'm saying, but we have to do more. And at the same time, we have to respect and to acknowledge the willingness of the African countries to negotiate their African continental free trade era. So I take the point of sequencing made by David. This is extremely important, and we are willing to work and to listen to what is their preferred sequencing situation. But at the same time, we have to be a credible trading partners with our interlocutors in Africa, the governments of the countries with whom we have negotiated, and we have to deliver on that. And as I repeat, we have far more important questions nowadays than simply the tariff questions. And these are the issues that have been mentioned by Trudy that we would need to tackle with a certain urgency.
Great, thank you, Ivano. And with that, I think I'll turn back to David. You mentioned that you had some thoughts on the sequencing, as Ivano has mentioned, and this need for proper sequencing. Would you like to share some of those with us?
Sure. Yes, indeed. And actually, first, let me just say that there seems to be very strong convergence in asking ourselves what are the alternatives. I think all of us are groping towards what would be the alternatives that would that would work. And just to pick out some phrases, repair work that needs to be done, a non-traditional approach, and so on. So yes, we are not starting from scratch, not from a blank slate, as has been said. And I think that in terms of how you can construct another model that would take into account the realities that on the ground that we are talking about. First, we need to look at the issue of sequencing, and not in a theoretical sense, but in a practical way, to ask ourselves what would be a realistic time frame that would allow these African economies to consolidate their integration projects, to call it that. And talking about innovation, I think, yes, indeed, we need to look at this in a way that we could also look at what sort of benchmarks, what sort of milestones would be needed during this period of transition, keeping in mind that the African continent is also the poorest continent, accounts for less than 3% of global trade, accounts for negligible, almost negligible amounts of imports into the EU market and so on. So let's just keep the asymmetrical perspective in mind. So let's look at what sort of benchmarks, what sort of milestones during a period of transition. Then let's also look at the way that the incentives have been structured, because incentives are also crucial to this. If I'm a business person, why do I want to not use what has been given to me on a platter? Why should I want to look at other arrangements? So let's also look at the issue of the incentives. And I think what all this points to, we cannot ignore the WTO in all of this, is that, and I think there is appetite at the WTO to look at this in a way that would give African countries this kind of transitional period to restructure and to grow their trade. At the WTO, I've often heard it said that the problem with S&DT is not so much for the African countries, it's for other emerging economies. So perhaps this is something that could be looked at. And I think that with such an arrangement, these are the issues that Trudy mentioned, which are indeed important issues, whether it's digitalization, it is the sustainability issues. I think with that, you also have a basis for looking at these issues as well. So, so in short, we need to rethink where Africa is in a realistic way, and then to see really how to come back and be able to respond to this reality on the ground. So maybe let me stop here.
Thanks, David. Trudy, if I can come back to you on sort of the non-traditional approach. You started getting into some of the areas, I think, that you believe that there is scope for really making constructive progress between the two parties already in the short to medium term. Could you perhaps say a bit more about that? I'd be interested to hear. And what would be, let's say, the potential approaches to achieve more mutually beneficial trade ties between the two continents that could already be approached, and in so doing, perhaps repair some of the difficulties in the current relationship and really create a more of a trust-based relationship between the two continents.
Thanks very much, Sean. And again, I'd like to just mention a couple of priors in terms of the very specific, let's say, the large looming challenges and that African countries face. And for me, climate is top of that list. But very, very important is the quest to develop and diversify productive capacity. So to improve our capacity to produce tradables competitively. And if we look at those two issues side by side, those two agendas side by side, then it certainly comes back to fill in some of the gaps that I've left in terms of the earlier contribution. I also want to underscore what Ivano and David have said as far as LDCs are concerned. The reality is that 33 of the world's 46 LDCs are African. And in a very few years' time, the LDC phenomenon will actually be an African one. That's the reality. But graduating from LDC status at this stage brings very little in terms of incentive to actually embrace that process in a very constructive way, because it does mean leaving behind a lot of support and opportunities that do exist. So this is something that we've got to keep in mind very, very importantly. And if we look at that reality, what does that mean, for example, in terms of new thinking around rules of origin? And Ivano, I think, underscored the importance of rules of origin. The reality is, to be honest, that the kind of rules of origin, whether it's the EU or we take a look at other streams of rules of origin governance, they're not reflective of a 21st century production reality. That's the bottom line. So one's got to think differently about modalities, methodologies, and so on to determine origin, to take a look at the integrity of a particular trade governance regime. But very, very importantly, when we take a look at the quest for the development of productive capacity and our capacity to trade, not only amongst ourselves, but with the rest of the world, then it comes back to dealing with the capacity issues, climate issues, and meeting certification governance standards, generally speaking, but also taking on board where society, where consumers are leading in terms of market developments. And that impacts on things, very practical issues, packaging, labeling, a whole bunch of, let's call them the technical barriers to trade, which is a really rather Pandora's box of things that are emerging and coming through. Now, those are the areas which, to be honest, can really assist African countries, industries, firms to develop their capacity to trade competitively, not only amongst ourselves, but with the rest of the world. Because what we do need to do is to take a look at the role of trade agreements in changing that opportunity set in terms of your relationship with trade partners. And at the moment, the kind of static, I'd say traditional approach to trade agreements is exactly that, static, dealing with a reality which in some senses was crafted in the 70s. If we look at the rules of origin regimes. So it means we've got to do the policy, the regulatory catch-up and reflect a new 21st century reality, because if we don't do that, the defensive approach among many African countries is to look inward, and one can't blame them. So it's very much taking a look at policy space issues, not wanting to enter into new, and not only new partnership agreements, but also agreements which cover new territory in terms of policy and governance, but rather to say, let's batten down the hatches, protect what we've got. And we're missing the opportunity for what we can become and develop. And I think that is one of the missing links in our trade policy and trade governance discourse, and in terms of agenda setting for ourselves, but also with partners like the European Union. Let me stop there. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks very much, Trudy. I mean, a question that sort of then raises or brings to my mind, but is also a question that is running through a lot of our thinking on this topic was, and Helmut, yeah, I'll turn to you, is if we're thinking about what needs to be done on the African side to sort of realize the opportunities and needs of a 21st century trade agenda. And we've heard already today a few times about asymmetries, about kind of a relationship that maybe is not meeting all the needs and is not creating as many benefits as it potentially could. Does the AfCFTA itself, does this process of continental integration, which is now, of course, also not happening against a blank slate. It's happening against both a patchwork of regional economic communities and their trade agreements, but also trade relations between Africa and the EU. Do you see this continental integration process as itself really a way to address some of the issues that Trudy and others have mentioned today, and taking advantage of opportunities, working towards greater trade capacity, for example, greater industrial and trade capacity, greater capacity just at the level of officials? We heard that there's the effect of stretching the trade negotiating and trade officials capacity of African countries. So do you see this new layer, let's call it that, of African integration process as creating more conducive opportunities and potential for one day a relationship between Africa and EU that actually works better for economic development in Africa?
Yeah, it surely can. I mean, it should be clear to all of us, and it's also a confession of mine. I mean, the fundamental potential of the CFTA lies in the fact that with the existing trade agreements, namely those with the European Unions, there is risk, and in some cases even reality, of African partners treating themselves, among themselves, worse than they treat third partners. And repairing that damage, of which we have not yet talked about much, is one of the fundamental potentials of the CFTA, and I'm clearly in favor of it. Secondly, EDEM, although that might be of comfort for Ivano and Trudy, and also for David, nobody can be against this avenue of searching for a non-traditional agenda. I'm bored myself, although I will come back to that in a second, to talk about this very traditional trade in goods and so on agenda. I do it since as Ivano does since 15 years. It is not particularly intellectually challenging. So everything that you can extract from this traditional way of doing trade things and say, hey, we raise it to a higher level, or treat it even in parallel while the other things are not yet done, some areas of standards, perhaps the issue of rules of origins instead of continuing dealing with it in the traditional regional agreements, raising it to a higher level, finding an innovative solution, especially with generic rules of origin and the departure of this case-by-case rules of origin, which then fill hundreds of pages in tariff books and so on and so forth. I'm clearly in favor of all that stuff. And so it is, to sum up, or to give an interim summary, if you like, Sean, we clearly need a two-track approach. This search for non-traditional items which can be extracted from the traditional trade negotiation agenda, moved on perhaps even quicker than the traditional items are, and then move on. But there remains the first avenue. I'm afraid that I have to underline it again. What is the situation? I mean, Ivano, I'm not in this business since yesterday. Let's take the two main recalcitrants at the African level, that is Nigeria and Tanzania. I mean, they came with their objections to the regional EPAs a bit at the 12th or 13th hour. They could have raised it earlier, but they have an issue in content. They have an issue in content that is, almost literally quoting, because I discussed it in detail 2 years ago with the Tanzanian government over there. They say the trade liberalization agenda, as it is currently agreed in the regional draft EPAs, obstructs precisely what Trudy asked for, the targeted creation of productive capacity. Translated in other words, targeted agricultural and industrial policy. It obstructs us in executing some deliberate, some selective industrial policy, and that is why we are not going to underwrite. So in a way or not, in one way or the other, this issue has to be resolved as well, notwithstanding the non-traditional things. And now comes the idea of David. The EU could generously respond to that. Okay, we, for the time being, we suspend further trade liberalization requirements in the current EPA agreements unless the African agenda has more advanced. That would take away a main argument from the Nigerian and the Tanzanian government and other member states that are rather recalcitrant, and would contribute to resolve this issue as well. So again, and to sum up, clearly in favor of a two-track approach, but that does not take away that we have to solve this very traditional issue in trade in goods as well, all the more as the argument that the current trade liberalization agenda holds up or restricts policy space for targeted industrial policy, for targeted creation of productive capacities, is not without foundations, even if it has been raised a bit, let's say, belatedly.
Thank you, Helmut. I just want to address the audience. If there are any questions, I don't see anything. Philomena, are there any questions in the chat box? I don't see any myself.
None as yet, but I'm hoping that people will start now that we're on the hour.
Great. Yeah, thanks. We have 15 minutes left. So if anybody does have any questions for the panelists, please you can even just indicate in the chat box, and we're happy to open it up. Otherwise, I have some more questions to follow up, but please do indicate if you would like to ask one of our panelists a question on this topic. But while I see Purva, would you like to just unmute yourself and ask?
Hello. I'd rather not, but okay, it's fine. I was just wondering if one of the panelists, I mean, especially Trudy, based on her intervention, would also have any opinion on how negotiations within Africa, so as part of the AfCFTA, are evolving, and whether they are somehow shaped by these outdated rules that Trudy referred to, whether they are shaped by the outdated rules as part of the negotiations with the EU. Does that have any connection, or are they completely independent of each other?
So to what degree the AfCFTA process is itself shaped by...
Exactly.
By the... Trudy, you want
the trade offers, in other words. Yeah.
Thanks.
The trade offers that African countries or African regions make to each other.
Yes.
Trudy or anyone else, would you like to have a
response? Can I ask my question?
Sorry. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, Philomena, please go ahead. We can gather a couple of questions.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panelists for brilliant discussions. I've heard most of the discussions revolve around trading goods, and I'm just a little bit curious as to how a future continent-to-continent agreement would deal with trading services. I mean, for argument's sake, we could say that legal possibilities for migration could be created through trade agreements between the EU and Africa in the area of services, and a meaningful linkage of the instruments, for example, migration policy and trade policy could be had comprehensively. I just want to know from Mr. Castello, Ivana, to what extent have these discussions been ongoing on the EU side, to deal with the issue around mobility and trading services? Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Purva. Thank you, Philomena, and thank you, Tobias, for sharing this study. I'm well aware of this study as well. This is on this theme in particular as well. So please, everyone who's interested, there's a link there provided by Tobias. But perhaps Trudy and/or Helmut, would you like to respond to this question about the connection between the negotiating agendas? To what degree the intra-African agenda is itself has been and is being influenced by negotiations between Africa and the EU, including perhaps the deepening of EPAs has been alluded to, or the revising of existing EPAs that has been alluded to already today. And then I'll come to you, Ivano, on this question around services.
Trudy first.
Please, Trudy.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Helmut, for that. Helmut, you've touched on a very important point. And David can help us here because he's been so closely involved with the AfCFTA processes. If we look at the tariff offers that have been made, and we've got to keep in mind we're in a particularly interesting time right now because tariff offers have been made and we launched trade, but no trade has taken place. And we were back to the drawing board to make tariff offers consistent with the agreed modalities. And I think Helmut's observation is really, really interesting because we are sometimes far kinder in terms of making tariff concessions, if I can put it that way, to our external trade partners than we are amongst ourselves. We're tough on one another. And it's extremely difficult to understand exactly how that plays out. But it does perhaps point to competition for what is a really small cake, so to speak, in terms of the benefits of intra-regional trade and also for trade opportunities with our global partners. So it's a really interesting discussion. We're also rather shy to embrace a forward-looking agenda, a non-traditional agenda. And so if one takes a look at the regional economic communities, their trading arrangements, keeping in mind, of course, that within a particular REC, not all REC members are members of the FDA. That's really important to keep in mind. We do find still a preoccupation with the traditional trade and goods agenda. And when it comes to services, in my view, rather unfortunately, we tend to follow pretty much the GATS model, knowing full well that if we take a look at the reality of services markets, that it's about domestic regulation, it's about regulatory cooperation, and hopefully harmonization at some point. We'll be brave enough to engage that agenda. So Philomena's question about movement of persons, immigration policy, and so on is absolutely critical. We have these enormous anomalies where we've got massive unemployment but skill shortages in certain countries. So it really is begging for us to embrace the labor market integration, if you like, part of a broader trade and development agenda. With that, capacity development issues are absolutely critical. So we find ourselves in a really, really interesting time. I want to come back, Sean, and this is a little bit of a tangent now, and I was going to say something around this because you had asked me and I didn't answer you about what kind of trade agreements or modalities for engagement, governance engagement, we could consider with global partners like the European Union. And it's quite interesting. I can share some experience as far as China's concerned. China's negotiated a free trade agreement with Mauritius, but with no other African countries, as far as I know, just yet. However, China engages at a bilateral level on very, very specific trade governance issues and signs, usually, memoranda of understanding, maybe about the export of apples from South Africa, or particular packaging requirements and so on. And it's a really interesting, very targeted approach. It's non-traditional in the sense that there's no demand on either side at this stage for the negotiation of an FTA, but these specific engagements are targeting particular aspects of our trade relationship and trade performance profile. So I think there are examples we can have a look at. Doesn't mean we've got to follow all of them, but that are already, in a sense, out of the traditional box of trade governance instruments, the traditional FTA agreement that we still predominantly see amongst ourselves, but also with our trade partners. Thanks, Sean.
Great. Thanks for coming back to that question. I think it's a very important example. Helmut, did you want to add something to Trudy's response?
Yeah, just one aspect. I mean, the thing is that be it within the existing regional economic communities in Africa, we have a phenomenon already, I repeat, within the existing RECs, let alone beyond the RECs vis-a-vis the other African trade partners, which is marked by what I called in my book the logic of exceptions and exclusions. That is, nominally after a transition period, a customs union, as we have in the European Union, has no internal tariffs and no exceptions and no specificities for this or that good at all. It is simply free. The reality of all African regional economic communities in their interior is the opposite. Is a widespread prevalence for accepting this good, accepting that good from the interior free trade, so that you can really talk about a widespread logic of exceptions and exclusions. And now it seems that the same mindset resurfaces at the level of the CFTA negotiations. What you offer to that or that other country or country group, oh no, not that freedom, not this freedom. And the thing I think for our African trade negotiators to understand, or perhaps willing to understand, is that you have to get away from this logic, marking specific goods, taking them off the list, treating them as an exclusion, and so on, instead of getting to generic rules, be it in tariffs, be it in rules of origin, be it in terms of standards, and so on. At all level, and there the traditional REC is not better or worse than the CFTA, unfortunately, at that stage, to get away from this case-by-case logic to generic elements of policy, which can perhaps then even be concluded earlier. That is obviously, I suppose, an important complement to what Trudy and also David said, I suppose.
Absolutely. No, thank you very much. I see we're running out of time. In the last 3 minutes, I'd like to give both Ivano and David another opportunity to speak and to share any last insights they may have. But particularly, Ivano, in your case, addressing this question from Philomena about services, the potential. What is there anything on the agenda there? Is there what the thinking on European side is for opportunities to develop, to deepen the trade and services relationship, but also this question that Jamie, thanks Jamie, has popped into the chat box about the possibilities for variable geometry. Considering that African countries really use this principle to move at different speeds, and what is the openness on the European side as well, thinking longer term for having a variable geometry approach towards Africa. And then after that, I'll turn to you, David. So Ivano, please.
I'll try to be brief. First of all, I would like to react on the importance of creating and supporting the consolidation of African manufacturing base. So the whole concept of regional and continental value chains. I mean, we are working in the European Commission together with the ITC in Geneva on a study in that regard. I think this is essential. We are very receptive to this argument of helping to build up the a genuine African industrialization policy. I think this is crucial. Therefore, also our willingness to study about the effects of rules of origin and the potential distortion that could have happened over the years between the different type of rules of origin protocol, and we would like to reflect about that also with our partners in Africa in that regards, possibly leading towards a long-term harmonization of rules. We will have to see what is the best solution. I still believe that it is possible for the African countries to revert to trade policy, to consolidate their industrial basis and to make sure that they can create niches for creating value, actually, because that is the bottom objective, the end of the line objective. It's to create value in their production and move away from the production of primary goods and being submitted to fluctuation of prices and so on and so forth. So I think this is extremely important that also we work with in conjunction with our African partners. The question on services, look, it has been there since the beginning of the EPA process, and we still haven't been negotiating or concluding any protocol on trading services, because it's not our intention to impose anything on trading services. I mean, we have enough, frankly, of a tedious debate on that front in Geneva. So, I mean, if countries from Africa perceive their interest, and by the way, there are countries in Africa with whom we have EPAs that have asked us to negotiate trading services. And actually, there's also a question of resources that we might have been in difficulty to respond, because there are other trading partners in the world as well. So, so if that is the case, then why not? We would be willing to explore that and to see what is best to do with the African partners to respond to their needs and to tackle specific questions that they would have. The issue of movement of services provider, of mode 4, look, it's first of all, we are getting out of the remit of trade, as you know, as far as the EU is concerned. So we are entering a zone that is the full sovereignty of our own member states, which creates additional difficulty. And we have attempted to do things in that front when we were negotiating with Tunisia, the so-called deep and comprehensive negotiation. So far, it didn't brought any positive outcome, precisely because of these difficulties of setting the limits of what we could accept and so on and so forth. So it's very much something that would require very careful discussions with regard to what the EU could accept and so on and so forth. And we are getting into this migration debate, which opens up a Pandora box on other types of sensitivity. So this has been a very mixed experience that leads me to believe that it's not mature time yet to discuss about these questions.
Thank you, Ivano. David, before we wrap up, would you like to respond to any of the questions that have come from the?
Sure. Let me sort of put it this way: that what would be my takeaway from this discussion? And I think what my takeaway is that all of us, I think, agree that there is scope to improve on the status quo. I think all of us recognize that the status quo is not ideal. There may be differences of emphasis between us as to how you take this forward, but including with Ivano. But I think we all agree that the status quo could be improved. And I think also we are not looking at just dealing with the low-hanging fruits, like fixing the rules of origin and so on, as important that is, but to take a deep and hard look at what it would take to do the repair work, to use Helmut's term, and to deal with both traditional and the non-traditional issues, which I think we all agree are important. And I can only end with going back to those two concepts that I brought into this debate, and that is that we need to look at the incentives, because the incentives are also related to this question of productive capacity, to this question of capacities to deal with the non-tariff issues, capacities indeed to deal with trading in services. So we need to look at how the incentives can be restructured. Without that, really, I think we're going around in circles. And then this issue of sequencing and the sort of realistic time frame that we need to keep in mind. I think this too is something that should be part of the rethinking. But the great value for me of all of this, and this is followed the CPDM for the last 15 or so years, is that ECPDM does provide this in their publications and in an event like this, an opportunity to rethink these issues and to interact with the EU Commission on these issues. And so for me, I think that's been an enormous privilege and benefit. Thank you.
And thank you, Devin. It's been our privilege to have all of you, all four panelists. I thank you so much for your time and for your valuable insights. And certainly this is a conversation that doesn't end here. And with David, we are discussing a paper that he is writing with his colleagues on this topic. So this is an ongoing discussion, and we will be in touch with. I think because we've run out of time, I'm not going to give a summary of the discussion. I think there were a lot of interesting points, and David has given a nice quick overview of some of the key takeaways there. So thank you for that. But again, just to thank the panelists for your time, for your insights. Absolutely, at ECDPM, we will continue to be working on this theme, on this topic, and hope to be able to engage with you further as the AfCFTA continues to be implemented, and as this idea and the ambition of strengthening Europe-Africa trade ties and potentially towards a continent-to-continent agreement progresses in the future. So with that, I'd just like to say once again, thank you to you, the panelists. Thank you, the audience, for giving up your Friday afternoon. And I hope this was a very enlightening discussion for you all. So thanks very much. Have a good day and have a great weekend. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks so much, Sean. Thanks, everyone. Good to
Thanks.
see you all. Good
Yeah,
weekend.
bye.
Great to see you.
Okay.
Yes.
Have a nice
Bye.
weekend, everyone. Thanks. Yeah. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye.